You're standing on Cheviot Beach, Victoria. It's the 17th of December 1967, a Sunday, and the height of the Australian summer. The surf is savage today. Anyone with half a mind for the sea can see that. The waves are breaking hard and irregular, churned up by days of rough weather, and the rip currents beneath the surface are invisible but brutal. And yet the Prime Minister of Australia is walking straight into it. Harold Holt is 59 years old. He is by any measure a powerful man, the leader of a nation, a wartime politician, a figure known across the Western world. He is also, by his own proud account, a strong and experienced swimmer. He has swum this stretch of coastline before. He knows these waters, or so he believes. You watch him wade in. The cold water rises past his waist. A wave takes him, and he keeps going. His companions call out from the shore. They can see what he cannot, or perhaps what he will not admit. The water is taking him. Within moments, the sea folds over him, and that is the last time anyone sees Harold Holt alive. No body is ever recovered, no wreckage, nothing, just a stretch of wild Victorian coastline, and a question that has haunted Australia for more than half a century. Harold Edward Holt was born in Sydney in 1908 and grew up to become one of Australia's most enduring political figures. He entered federal parliament in 1935 as a member of the United Australia Party, and over the following 3 decades built a reputation as a capable, energetic, and occasionally ruthless political operator. He served under Robert Menzies for years, as Minister for Labor, as Treasurer, as Deputy Leader, always positioned just behind the throne. When Menzies finally retired in January 1966, Holt stepped forward. He became the 17th Prime Minister of Australia, and he arrived in the role with considerable momentum. He was in many ways the modern face of the Liberal Party. Where Menzies had been patrician and measured, Holt was gregarious, media-savvy, and socially accessible. He embraced the press. He was photographed in his swimming trunks on Australian beaches. He gave television interviews with an ease that was still relatively new in Australian politics. His personal life was equally colourful. He was devoted to the sea in a way that went beyond recreation. It was almost an identity. He scuba dived. He spearfished. He swam in conditions that made others hesitate. Friends and colleagues noted, with varying degrees of concern, that Holt treated the ocean as though it owed him a kind of immunity. He had also been dealing with a significant physical injury in the months before his disappearance. His shoulder had been causing him serious pain, an injury sustained, fittingly, in the surf. Doctors had advised him to rest. Holt, characteristically, did not. By December 1967, he had been Prime Minister for less than 2 years. Australia was deeply involved in the Vietnam War, and Holt had made his support for the American alliance explicit in ways that still echo in the national memory. He had travelled to Washington and told President Lyndon B. Johnson that Australia would go all the way with LBJ, a phrase that defined him in the public mind, for better and for worse. He was a busy man, a significant man, and on the weekend of the 16th and 17th of December, he had come down to his holiday property on the Mornington Peninsula for a brief rest. He was accompanied by friends. The weather was rough. The weekend was, by most accounts, fairly ordinary, right up until the moment it wasn't. Cheviot Beach sits near Portsea, at the southern tip of the Mornington Peninsula, roughly 90 kilometres south of Melbourne. It is not a gentle beach. The coastline there is exposed and rocky, and the Bass Strait can drive enormous swells directly onto it without obstruction. On the 17th of December 1967, the conditions were particularly dangerous. The surf had been building for days. Holt arrived at the beach that morning with a small group of companions, including Marjorie Gillespie and 3 others. Those who were with him later recalled that the sea looked rough enough that none of them chose to follow him in. Holt waded into the water regardless. He moved through the shallows and into the breaking surf with the confidence of a man who did not believe the ocean could beat him. His companions watched from the shore. What happened next was swift and irreversible. Holt was caught in the surge. He was seen to struggle, or perhaps simply to be overwhelmed. Accounts differ slightly on the detail, but agree on the essential fact. He went under. He did not come back up. His companions raised the alarm. Police and emergency services were called. Within hours, one of the largest search and rescue operations in Australian history had been launched. Naval divers entered the water. HMAS Vampire, a Royal Australian Navy destroyer, was deployed. Australian Army personnel combed the coastline. United States naval assets joined the search. Aircraft flew grid patterns over the water. For days, searchers worked the coastline and the waters off Cheviot Beach. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no identifiable remains of any kind. Harold Holt, the sitting Prime Minister of Australia, had simply ceased to exist. The official conclusion reached after the extensive search effort was that Harold Holt had drowned. Conditions at Cheviot Beach that day were consistent with a fatal accident. The rip currents and surf were powerful enough to overwhelm even a strong swimmer. Holt's pre-existing shoulder injury may have compromised his ability to fight back against the water. These were reasonable, evidence-supported conclusions. A formal inquest was not held for nearly 4 decades. It was not until 2005 that a Victorian coroner, Graham Johnstone, conducted an inquiry into the disappearance. The finding confirmed what authorities had long maintained, that Harold Holt had drowned accidentally at Cheviot Beach on the 17th of December 1967. But the absence of a body and the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the man involved meant that the official finding did little to close the door on alternative theories. Some of those theories were speculative, others were, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. The most persistent and remarkable theory was advanced by journalist and author Colin Simpson and later popularised by an American writer named Anthony Gray, who published a book in 1983 claiming that Holt had been a Chinese intelligence asset, a spy, and that on the day of his disappearance, he had not drowned at all. According to this theory, a Chinese submarine had surfaced off Cheviot Beach and extracted Holt, who was then taken to China, where he lived out the rest of his days. This claim was investigated and comprehensively rejected by serious historians and intelligence analysts. There is no credible evidence to support it, but it persisted in popular imagination with a tenacity that says something about how unsettling the case remained to ordinary Australians. Other theories included a staged disappearance, that Holt had faked his own death to escape the pressures of office, or to be with one of his alleged romantic interests. These too lack evidentiary support. What investigators and historians consistently return to is the simple Tata truth. A man in his late 50s with a limping shoulder injury swam alone into dangerous surf on a day that no one else dared to. The sea, indifferent to rank or reputation, took him. Harold Holt's disappearance remains, in the technical and legal sense, an unsolved case in that no body was ever recovered and no inquest finding can be absolutely definitive in the absence of physical remains. But among historians, forensic experts, and those who have studied the case most closely, the consensus is clear. He drowned. What the case leaves behind is something harder to categorise. It exposed the strange vulnerability of power. The fact that the head of a government could walk into the sea and simply not return, without conspiracy, without drama, without any explanation more complicated than the physics of water and current, and a man who believed himself invincible. Australia managed the crisis with a kind of stunned pragmatism. John McEwen was sworn in as caretaker Prime Minister within days. John Gorton followed. The government continued. The nation moved on, as nations do. But Cheviot Beach did not fade from the cultural memory. It became a kind of shorthand for the unknowable, for the limits of authority, for the sea's fundamental refusal to respect titles or legacies. There is a certain bleak irony in the fact that the Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre opened in Melbourne in 1969, just 2 years after his death. The name has prompted raised eyebrows ever since, though those who knew Holt well have suggested he would have found it entirely fitting. His body was never found. It almost certainly rests somewhere in the waters off the Mornington Peninsula, carried by currents and time beyond any possibility of recovery. The sea keeps its own record. The disappearance of Harold Holt is one of those cases that resists the satisfaction of a clean ending. The coroner ruled, the historians weighed in, the submarine theory was debunked, and yet something lingered. The image of a man walking into heavy surf on a bright summer morning, the shore receding behind him, his companions watching from dry land. It is a reminder that the most perplexing mysteries are not always the ones with the most complicated answers. Sometimes the sea simply takes a person and leaves us to make of it what we will. If you found this case compelling, there are more stories waiting. Cases from the margins of the Australian record, where the evidence runs out and the questions remain. Subscribe so you don't miss our next case.